horrible monsters with colorless eyes and tentacles sticking out of their mouth. The warrior stands in the center, and the ugly monsters slowly surround him. The monsters with tentacles sticking out of their mouths attack the warrior. The warrior uses the force to form a whirlpool of stone around his arm. He covers his face with his hand to keep the debris out of his eyes. A huge and powerful wave blows out in all directions, heading straight for the monster. He stands around the monsters, torn to pieces by the massive wave of impact. A new crowd of ugly creatures appears. One of them says, "Human, who are you?" The warrior steps forward and says he is an apostle of justice who fights evil. He folds his arms across his chest and says he is Lucas Troman, the strongest master of mankind with 9 stars. The monsters look at him and talk about how such a human can stand up to us. Lucas smiles and says that after they realize their wishes, they want to help the rest of the world. It's kind of like volunteering, Lucas says with a smile. He's a tall, blue-eyed blonde with long hair. The monsters stand and stare at Lucas, one of them saying that this weak man is going to beat us. Lucas raises his hand up and takes off. A bright light and a large pictogram appears above him. The monsters have their heads up and are watching. He rises up and looks at the dumbfounded monsters, a slight smile on his face. He stretches his arms forward and directs a stream of fiery lava at the monsters, and some smoke starts to appear from this ball. A huge avalanche of fire that powerfully flies in different directions and demolishes everything in its path. Floating in the air, he saw on the ground lying torn apart bodies of monsters. The power of his stream was so strong that it tore these monsters to pieces. He looked at the ground where the remains of the monsters were lying and said that people are not so weak. Some large, powerful circles formed that emitted a bright light that made Lucas's eyes hurt. He kept covering his face with his hands. The bright light made his eyes hurt a lot, and the circles started sucking him in. Lucas screamed, but he continued to be sucked into this bright vortex. He could not do anything. The flow was too strong, and he could not fight it. He found himself in a strange place. In front of him stood something of huge size in a hooded cloak. This something said that he was the law of this world. Out of the hood was a single glowing eye and darkness, a demigod. He said, "Those whom you humans consider a god and praise." Lucas raised his index finger up and said that he personally does not praise anyone. A huge creature with glowing eyes told Lucas that they could no longer watch you destroy order and laws. He started shouting at the creature that what kind of order and laws are we talking about if the world looks like such a horror? The creature looked at Lucas and said that your abilities are much more developed than those of other people, but still a human being remains a human being. An eye appeared from the palm of the creature's hand. Lucas did not understand what was happening. He did not know what was going to happen and what to do in this situation. The huge hand squeezed Lucas with such force that his armor just fell in 2 pieces and fell from his body. Then, from these huge hands, many other hands started to appear, grabbing his hair, his face. Lucas couldn't concentrate his mana. The hands began to widen his eye. They opened it wider and wider. He heard a voice saying that sin is opposing God. This sin is not allowed to man. There was this bright light from above, and many hands held Lucas in their grip. 1,000 hands reached out to Lucas. The voice said, "Befriend the impenetrable darkness within the abyss, but never trust it." The creature shone its eyes and said, "Return to the void. Make friends with endless suffering. Regret your existence." Huge hands in great numbers grabbed Lucas's face. "This is the punishment I give to those people who defied God," spoke the voice. Present time, from the blow, the guy flew back into the wall. The force of the blow was so powerful that pieces of the wall broke off and flew apart. 3 guys stood over the guy one of them kicked. Red said, "What? You think we're poor, carrying around pennies like that?" The guy's got blood all over his face. A voice behind him says that the financial condition of the 3rd son of the noble Blake family is deplorable. One of them stands laughing and says that unlike his successful brothers from the Blake family, he's just plain trash. He grabs him by the hair and says he likes that about him anyway. Frey yelped in pain because the redhead was holding his hair hard. The other fat guy and the short guy next to him looked at it and said that it wasn't enough, that you were a disgrace to your family, you were academically mediocre. As he continued to hold Frey's hair, he looked up into his eyes and said that you're still not dead. He laughed and looked at his broken face and said that if it were him, he would have died a long time ago. Then holding Frey by the hair, looking at his face in abrasions and scratches, Tears streamed from Frey's eyes. The other looked at the redhead holding Frey's crying hair and scratched the back of his head. Then he said that Frey was just being pushy and wanted to get his ass handed to him. Looking at Frey, who was crying, he smiled his nasty, cocky smile. The red-haired guy swung around and gave Frey another hard punch. The blow turned Frey's head sideways. He smilingly said that no matter how many times he hit Frey, he never got tired of it. It's just perfect. The red-haired guy sat on top of Frey, who was lying on his back, and continued to hit him hard on his face. The other two stood back. He lifted Frey up by his hair, sweat beading on his face from the pain, his face aching from the blows. Then he pushed Frey with all his strength right into the hands of his fat friend, who was getting ready to strike again. The fat one swung with all his might. His arm was huge, so his punch sent Frey flying the other way. He fell to the ground and curled up, trying to protect himself from the hooligans, who kicked him with all their might. All three of them stood looking at Frey, who was writhing in pain, and smirked at the pleasure they felt in beating him. With his face on the ground, he was lying there with his mouth open. His face was covered in abrasions. He couldn't even get up. His body was aching from the blows. He was writhing in pain. He was clutching his stomach. He was begging to stop hitting him. He was begging to stop. Another kick hit Frey in the head. He screamed in pain, but no one cared. They beat him mercilessly. Putting his foot on Frey's breathless body, the red-haired guy said that there would be a magic lesson tomorrow. He had a smile on his face. Continuing to smile, he tells Frey that tomorrow's magic class, Frey is paired with him, and continued to laugh. His foot continued to stand on the head of the beaten Frey, the redhead said about not overdoing it. After all, he is kind. Standing on Frey's head with his foot, he put his hands in his pants pockets and said that he would make sure that Frey would remember this day for the rest of his life. It was starting to get dusk outside. The three guys had finished beating up their classmate and were looking on contentedly. The three friends turned around and started to leave. One of them shouted at him without turning around, telling him to hurry up and go home. Lying face down, he stretched out one arm in an attempt to move. In the distance, he could hear the words, "They like beating him so much." He clenched his fist, but he was unable to get up. He could hear in the distance how they were walking and laughing at him, and how they beat him up. Frey had no strength to get up. His whole body ached from the blows he had taken. The pain stiffened his movements. Lucas realized that he had no chance to move at all. The arms wrapped around his body, preventing him from moving. He thought he heard something. He became quiet and listened, because he clearly heard something. He tried not to breathe to catch the sounds. As he stood still, he heard nothing else. There was silence all around him. No matter how hard he tried to listen, he heard nothing else. All around him was silence, a gray web of some kind. Lucas thought that it was probably a hallucination. Nothing surprising about it. Lucas was being held by a huge hand, and many more small hands were wrapped around him from different sides of his body. Lucas thought about going crazy in here. He thought about how long he had spent among this undead, hundreds, maybe thousands of years. He gathered his strength in his fist and began to call out to the god. The surroundings were depressing, black sky overhead, some ruins, if this is what fear is. Maybe it's not an auditory hallucination. Maybe it's his subconscious talking to him. He didn't realize he was such a weak man. Abruptly, a bright light shone on his face. He stared at it wide-eyed and couldn't understand what was going on. He found himself in the throne room. He was on his knees. In front of him on the throne sat his father, who told him that he had told him to disappear from his life. His father then stood up and told Lucas that he couldn't allow him to continually undermine the honor and authority of their family. Looking at his father with eyes filled with horror at hearing his father's words, Lucas couldn't believe that his father had said that to him. He lowered his head down. He was sad and unclear why his father was doing this to him, what he had done wrong. His father sat back on the throne. Lucas continued to kneel in front of him. He said to his father, "Is it a serious sin to be weak?" He interrupted Lucas and said that he had enough, and he had no right to answer the question. His father started to come down from the throne and ordered him that the Blake family does not allow those who cannot become strong. Lucas looked up and asked his father if it was Frey, but there was still no answer. His father approached him and told him that he no longer recognized his existence. He was no one to him anymore. Lucas's eyes began to water from hearing his father's words. He couldn't believe it. He remained on his knees, tears rolling down his face, and his father left. It's almost night outside. Many of the windows are lit. This is Frey's house. The only window that wasn't lit was Frey's room. A bookcase with various books on it, with diagrams on the wall. This is Frey's room. A desk on the desk was a pen, a notebook with an open blank sheet, a photograph, and a red jar of some kind. Standing next to his bed, the lights were off. Frey held the red jar in his hands and studied it. As he held the jar, the thought flashed through his mind to leave his life. His hands were sweating and shaking from the strain. His mind flashed with various thoughts. Looking at the jar with frightened eyes, sweat rolling down his face, he thought to himself that leaving was really frightening. Being held captive by those hands, which were wrapped around his body like snakes, preventing him from even moving, Lucas was simply immobile. He looked up with his blue eyes and said to himself, doubt, doubt, and doubt again. He tried to see something in the distance, but he couldn't. A creature in a cloak, hood over his head, eyes glowing. He's talking about how he's going to end up questioning his existence soon. Lucas just couldn't stand the sound of his voice and screamed at him to shut up. He clutched his hands in a vice grip and started screaming loudly that what kind of god you are, what kind of order, what kind of laws do you really approve of this absurd world? Clenched his teeth, he realized why this world was so ugly and who had brought it to this state. That's why he must never give up. Half god. If you could endure such a life, I would gladly experience hell. Frey is blank-eyed, vomiting something red, in an incomprehensible state, looking at it all. Staring and not knowing what it was, Lucas looked up at the bright light. Kneeling down and holding his stomach, Frey saw all around him what he was throwing up. In his head, he hears a voice telling him to get out of his life. His hand is on the ground next to the liquid he threw up. He thinks to himself that he would rather be dead. Lucas opened his mouth. He didn't realize what was happening. Who the hell is this? Who entered my mind without realizing it? He heard someone's voice saying that he didn't blame anyone, that he was the only one to blame for everything, and only him. As he continued to listen to the voice, Lucas heard someone saying that a bird without wings is doomed to die, as nature intended. On his knees, Frey said that it was his fault, for not being born with wings. Tears rolling down his face, he said it was his fault that he couldn't get stronger. Suddenly, Frey started to fall. His eyes closed, his face all bruised and bruised after being beaten up by 3 people from the class. Around him, lying on the ground, people gathered around him, saying that he was the Blake family's dirty stain, a disgrace to the academy. The red-haired guy who beat him up leaned over to him with a cheeky smile and said to him, "Why do you even live?" He smiled and told Frey that if it were him, he'd be dead long ago. The people crowded around him, and no one was even trying to help him in any way. Everyone was just standing around talking about it. Lucas was looking down at Frey from above, but he couldn't move or do anything to help him. He looked at Frey and tried to reach out his hand to him. Suddenly, the hands that had been gripping Lucas's body so tightly began to loosen and let go. Lucas didn't realize what was happening. Looking at Frey, he thought that the moment this child entered my consciousness, it was like the sun was shining on. He was lying face down on the ground, his face covered in wounds, blood coming out of his mouth, tears dripping from his eyes. Lucas got down on one knee and put his hand on Frey's head. He wondered to himself who this kid was. He lay still, mouth open, tears dripping from his eyes, and Lucas kept his hand on his head. His eyes were all watery. He just wouldn't move. He didn't even want to move. The tears came in hailstones. Lucas thought that if he could be reborn again, then by all means. A teardrop fell to the ground. He's going to push himself off the ground, fly to the highest point in the world, and look down at the whole world through his eyes. Lucas stood over Frey's lying body. He thought about how they were the biggest and strongest wings. When he opened his eyes, he saw that his whole face and body was bruised and abrasion. His body was Frey's, but he was on his knees and looking at his hands. It was Lucas who had been reborn in Frey's body, staring with surprised eyes at the hands that were no longer Frey's but as Lucas. His face all bloody and abrasions, after Fren had been beaten up by 3 scumbags from his own group. Lucas, who was in Frey's body, said that he was finally back. He looked at the pictogram on the wall. It had been a long time. 4,000 years. There were pills on the floor, spilling out of a red jar. Lucas thought of Frey Blake as the weakest man in the world. Standing near the mirror, Lucas, and pulled a rope off his hair, talking about how he was Lucas Trami, the strongest mage in the world. He ripped the ribbon Frey always used to tie his ponytail with out of his hair. He went to the window, which was curtained tightly. He said of the freedom he had given. Opening the curtains on the window, his view was of the night and the full moon. He thought to himself that Frey had given him freedom, and he had given him wings. Going to the window and putting his hand to it, Lucas looked out into the distance. Opening the windows and looking outside, he began to breathe in the fresh air. He looked out the window with his head up at the sky, where the big, bright moon was shining. He stretched his index finger into the sky where the stars and moon were shining. He said, "Demigod, he calls himself a god." Looking out the window and looking up at the sky said that, "Just wait a little, demigod. I'll eat you with one bite." Continuing to poke the sky with his index finger, Lucas said about how he would soon pay a visit to the demigod. It's night outside, green grass, a broken fence, and a barn that's starting to fall apart. In the middle of this place stands Lucas, who's glowing so brightly that he lights up the whole place. With his torso bare, he stood in a pose with his eyes closed, his body still radiating bright energy. Standing with his eyes closed and thinking to himself that he can't fully control his power with Frey's current body, as he continues to stand and glow, he says to himself that he needs to replenish his energy, as well as lay the groundwork for mana assimilation. In order to fight the demigods, he must regain his former strength as quickly as possible. He must become even more powerful. I must become even stronger. I must, Lucas thought. Raising his hand palm up, no need to be greedy. He got this chance after waiting 4,000 years. He closed his eyes, sweat running down his face from the exertion. Put aside your recklessness and tame your anger. Standing, he thought about the fact that now he had to do his best. Then he took a deep breath and closing his eyes again tried to relax. Abruptly, he opened his eyes. All he could think about was that he needed to become more powerful and stronger as soon as possible. His body was all glowing. He stood focused. He was trying to concentrate his strength and his power. He stood and glowed, looking at his hands. He thought about the fact that with this level, he had reached the level of 5 stars. Suddenly, Lucas felt sick. His eyes rounded. He felt very nauseous. He was very nauseous. He curled up in half, and some red liquid started pouring out of his mouth. A huge stream of red liquid came out of his mouth, so much that he thought he was going to choke. He squatted in front of the red liquid. It was toxins that had been building up in Frey's body and mind for years. Standing with his mouth soaked in toxins, he thought, I can't believe I finally spewed it all out. Leaning over once more, he thought to himself that he needed to cleanse his entire body of the toxins. It came out very little. Frey's Academy, students rushing to class, all dressed in specialized uniforms. The 2 guys who beat up Frey go to class. One named David, the other Jack. The fat one asks the redhead, David, why are you here so early? David turns to Jack and says he's here early because he's looking forward to today's sparring matches. He said that once again he wanted to take Frey down. Jack said he had to be careful. Since he'd seen him in the infirmary recently, he grabbed a can of sleeping pills and took off. As the students approached the entrance to the academy, David said, I'm afraid he's decided to take his own life. Do you want to bet 10 food stamps? Lucas stood in a bent posture. He was still drained of toxins. He was exhausted. He couldn't remember how many times he had thrown up, coughing and coughing and coughing. He couldn't figure out how much more toxins would come out of his system. Suddenly, Lucas realized that he was no longer vomiting. Maybe it was all over, and this horror would not happen again. He stood up and looked at the ground around him. It was covered in toxins. Lucas was shocked at how much toxins had come out of Frey's teenage body. Standing up and with a stained mouth after vomiting endless times, his face was very tired. He looked at the academy Frey was attending. Lucas thought about how this guy had been through a lot, but not as much as he had. Then, feeling very hungry, he headed to the academy cafeteria called West Road. Everyone in the cafeteria turned around and looked at Lucas with puzzled faces. They looked at Lucas as he greedily devoured his food. The students were talking about how he probably hadn't eaten in a week. Shoving everything on the table into his mouth, he said it was delicious. It was a masterpiece. This soup was so beautiful, he said. He had a mouthful of food. He thought that after 4,000 years, everything would be delicious. Is that really Frey Blade? It's unbelievable. He just melts in your mouth. He realized that now he was in Frey's body. Now he had to play his part. Now he had to pretend to be Frey. Looking at the students passing by and thinking that at his advanced age, he has to mess around with these little kids. Are you kidding me? Going and thinking there's nothing to be done about it after all, and Frey's not 4,000 years old. He has to figure out how the world works. So he doesn't really have any other choice. Lucas stood up and leaned his head against the classroom door. He was in no hurry to get in. Closing his eyes, he tried to tune in. He took a few breaths and exhaled quietly. Then he opened his eyes and told himself that there was no rush. You have to take things slowly. With these words, he gathered his thoughts and strength and opened the door to the classroom where Faye was studying. When he entered the classroom, Lucas saw the long desks where the students were sitting. Also in this class were the same 3 assholes who had beaten up Frey. As soon as he stepped into the classroom, all the students turned to look at him, staring at him intently. David didn't even try to look away. He shouted to the whole class that he had won 10 food stamps because Frey hadn't killed himself. He laughed. As Lucas walked forward, he heard David talking about how he needed to be a little smarter. Damn, that's annoying. He suddenly looked very wary and focused his attention on the floor. Meanwhile, David put his foot right in front of Lucas's legs, hoping he wouldn't notice and fall. Lucas stopped abruptly right in front of David's leg, who was sitting on a chair, his hands in his pocket and smiling evilly. Then he turned to Lucas, who was in Frey's body, saying something about finally waiting for his friend. Thinking about it, Lucas pondered why this red-haired guy called him friend. Maybe Frey was friends with him at the academy. Looking at him, his gaze was piercing and sly. A slightly noticeable snide smile appeared on David's face. As he walked by, he heard someone call out to him, shouting, "Hey, Frey!" Lucas couldn't get used to being in Frey's body. A huge, fat Jack came up behind him and put his hand on his head and told him to hand over 10 food stamps. He waved his hand over Lucas's head and yelled, "Give me the 10 coupons! You made me lose them!" Lucas thought he was going to hit him. Looking at that disgusting fat face of Jack's, he thought that it was hardly a friend of Frey's. Such bastards have been found in all times. Suddenly, Lucas's eyes rounded. He didn't expect such a reaction from his body. His body began to shake. Meanwhile, Jack grabbed his cheek with 2 fingers. He began to shake like a leaf. He wondered what was happening and why he was trembling at the sight of him. He realized that his body was trembling at the sight of this fat goon who was now rubbing his cheek. Jack opened his big mouth and spat and started yelling at him to give him his food stamps fast. Holding Lucas by the cheek with one hand, he swung the other to punch him hard in the face. But by some unknown force, without even doing anything, Lucas pushed the big Jack away, and he flew away. Lucas looked down at his hands in surprise. The red-haired David turned around sharply and didn't understand what had happened, and why Jack was flying with all his might in the other direction right into the wall. All the students with surprised faces looked at what had happened, and no one could understand how it had happened. A girl with long red hair and huge brown eyes, who was sitting at her desk reading a book, opened her mouth in surprise. Jack looked questioningly at Lucas and didn't understand what had just happened. How this had happened, he didn't understand. Shoving his hands into his pants pockets, Lucas realized that these were the same bastards who had tried to take his life. The one with the embittered face scowled and looked at Lucas with an angry face. Jack took the back of his head with one hand and said to him, "You know that look," and with his other hand, he started to swing for a punch. With a furious look on his face, Jack swung to strike, his teeth clenched, his arms swinging very hard. As Lucas continued to stand with his hands in his pockets, one of his hands began to glow and emit lightning, even though he wasn't doing anything, just standing there. A powerful ring of energy began to emanate from Lucas. This wave hit Jack, who flew to the other end of the classroom with great speed. Everyone in the classroom got up from their seats and watched with open mouths as Jack flew into the wall, knocking down chairs. He flew to the other end of the classroom, hit the wall, and sat on the floor unconscious, his head down, his arms limp. Sitting with his head down, his eyebrows and mouth were bloody. His mouth was open. He didn't even move. His body went limp, and Lucas stood there looking at him. His hands were in his pants pockets as before. He didn't even take them out. The students were whispering among themselves, wondering how Lucas had done it, how Jack could fly away so easily. He stood there with puzzled eyes, wondering how he could do that, why he couldn't control his power. Lucas thought to himself, clutching his hand to his face, regretting that he had done that because he was just a kid. He stood and looked at Jack. Red-haired David sat in shock and looked at Lucas. All were in complete incomprehension how this could happen. Jack's friend David looked at Jack's limp body with his mouth open and wondered how this could have happened. Everyone around him was talking about how this Frey was so weak and no one could believe in such power and strength. The students stood with their mouths open and looked at Lucas, who was in Frey's body, and of course no one even knew about. A red-haired girl with big brown eyes ran up to Lucas and clung to his chest. A voice sounded near the front door to the classroom to clarify what the noise was. The students turned around. Professor Dio entered the classroom. Professor Dio stood with his hands behind his back and looked around the class. He couldn't understand what had happened, why everyone was so scared. He and the other students approached Jack, who was sitting against the wall. One of the students said that Jack suddenly fell down and he didn't move. The professor stared at Jack sitting against the wall, who didn't even move, but sat like a sack, all slumped over. The professor squatted down in front of Jack, who was sitting against the wall and was unconscious. Professor Dio took a closer look and noticed that Jack's body had traces of used mana. His face changed dramatically. He was in complete shock from what he had seen. His thoughts were confused. He did not understand how this was possible, opening his mouth at what he saw, because no professor has such an opportunity to use such a skill. The professor rose to his feet and scrutinized every student in the class. A thought flashed through his mind. Who would have thought it? Another professor named Kevin entered the class. He said that while Professor Dio would take care of Jack, he would teach the class. He looked around the class, paying special attention to the female students who were sitting in the classroom. He moved his gaze from desk to desk, where the female students were sitting, and looked at them brazenly. Professor Kevin stood puffing and panting, thinking to himself that the air in the classroom is delicious, and all because there are many girl cadets here. Turning his gaze to a beautiful girl with long red hair and big brown eyes. Her name was Isabella. He looked at Isabella with his disgusting, lustful gaze. His face broke into a disgusting smile. Then the professor came to his senses and coughed a little and looked at the rest of the class. Lucas was sitting at his desk, looking at his textbook. Another student was sitting next to him, propping his head up with his hand. "Frey?" said the professor. The girls were sitting there whispering among themselves that Professor Kevin was a horny pig and talking about how nasty and disgusting he was. Professor Kevin came to the desk where Lucas was sitting. He raised his face to the professor and looked at him. He turned to Lucas and said, "Cadet Frey, you even managed to come to class today. What happened to you?" He looked at Lucas with his nasty, fat face and glared at him and kept his eyes on him. He raised his head and looked at the professor with an incomprehensible face. Standing in front of Lucas's desk and thinking that Frey looked like a bookworm when you look at his skinny figure, folding his arms in front of him, Lucas smilingly told Professor Kevin that he was very busy. The professor asked him back, "What are you busy?" The girls behind the professor's back looked at him and talked about how he was so mean. That's why no one wanted to take his classes. Professor Kevin turned to Lucas, saying that he had more important things to do than the professor's lessons. He smiled and said that of course he had better things to do. He was at the peak of his youth. He stood looking at Lucas with an angry face. He told him not to laugh or he would get in trouble. The professor said that of course he was at the peak of his youth. Then he smiled wryly and said that he didn't think his class was unimportant at all. Then Professor Kevin said, "So here's student Frey." The guys in the class started to chatter that Frey was already in a lot of trouble. Now he was going to be even worse. Isabella sat and looked at Professor Kevin and Frey, or rather Lucas, in Frey's body. The professor said he wanted to ask him a question. He told Lucas that if he couldn't answer his questions, he would have to admit his behavior was defiant. Lucas sat down a little and looked at Professor Kevin, who was looking at him side. The professor said, "Here's the first question. You have to name the 3 weapons of the evil warrior king Casagino. The answer must be exceptionally correct." His eyes rounded at the question Professor Cavino asked. He didn't even expect him to ask him such a question. He jumped up from his desk and stared at Professor Kevin and asked him what he said. Standing with big rounded eyes, his face was questioning. He said to Professor Kevin, "You asked about Casagino? 4,000 years ago, beautiful mountains, green trees, very beautiful nature. On the side of the mountain, a warrior stands looking at all this beauty. He's very pumped up. His hair is in a ponytail. It was the same Casagino. He stood quietly and stared into the distance, his broad, muscular back. He stood motionless as if he was preparing for something. As he stretched out his arm, he felt it become energized and powerful. Then he clenched his hand into a huge fist. The power was coming to him. A glow emanated from his hand. He sat down, his arms stretched forward, and his whole body seemed to glow with bright fire, power, strength, and energy came from him. From him came a strong and powerful stream of energy. He gathered all his power and energy in a fist. He made a huge and powerful blow. The power of his blow completely blew all the rocks in half, blew branches and trees. All the rocks and branches flew in different directions. His blow left a deep mark. It shattered half the slope. He looked at what he had done. He tore down half the mountain. He tore down the treetops. He didn't know what else to do. Sighing a sigh of relief, Casagin looked at what was left of his blow. Lucas came up behind him and told him to calm down, or he would destroy everything on this land, and he had already blown half of the mountains down. When he turned back, he saw that Lucas was standing in front of him with one hand in his pocket and the other hand holding his backpack. He looked at him and said he hadn't seen him in a while, his eyes serious and focused. "Green grass. There is a fence made of some kind of rods. It's the fence outside Casagino's house." Sitting in Casagino's gazebo, with his hand on his chin, he was bored, but Casagin kept practicing and practicing. With his hand resting on his chin and sighing heavily, he asked how long he was going to train after he met an old friend. He told Lucas that he could have a cup of tea and not to be shy. Sitting with a cup of tea in his hand, and said that this ignoramus knows nothing but his training and will never get married. Stopping and sighing heavily, Casagin looked away. He turned to Lucas and said about how a woman's heart is hard to understand like yours. He got angry, and what's wrong with me? He went on to say that the love of a woman can destroy one's self-control. He leaned close to Lucas and said that the desire for the indomitable makes the ability to stand on one's own 2 feet ineffective. He continued that warriors must be as still as a rock in front of a woman. Sitting and looking at him, Lucas asked him if that is not the case with mages. "Answer me, friend." He looked at him with a serious look and waited for him to answer. He looked thoughtfully with his blue eyes at Casagino. He was silent. In the courtyard of Casagino's house, there were jugs standing at the house. He said to Lucas, "If I were a girl, I would date a stone if it were beautiful. Just drink your tea." Lucas lowered his eyes, tears rolling down his face at Casagino's words. He pounded his hand on the desk. Professor Kevin stood across from him and looked at him. Lucas thought to himself, "How can you say that about a warrior Casagino?" The professor turned to Lucas, who was in Frey's body, and asked him, "What, Cadet Frey? Can't you give me an answer to the question asked?" The students sat and thought that how can the professor ask questions that are not even in the textbooks? They all thought that Frey was caught and would not answer. Sitting at her desk, Isabella thought that this pervert was just using him to show off his knowledge. She got up from her desk and turned to Professor Kevin. "Excuse me, Professor Kevin." Standing with her hands on the desk, she said that this question had nothing to do with the current magic lesson. All the students turned to Isabella with astonished faces. They were thinking to themselves why she was acting like that. Lucas looked at her and sat with his mouth open. He thought she was so pretty, but she spoke in such a commanding tone. Professor Kevin raised his fat, nasty face at Isabel. What a nasty professor he was. He puckered his fat lips and hissed, "Cadet Isabel." She immediately began to answer the professor that Casagin was a true warrior and only used his mana when he was training. She looked at Professor Kevin with her big brown eyes and told him that Casagin could not be considered a maid. The professor with his big belly started to climb the stairs. He said that Isabella was right. He really wasn't a magician. The professor climbed the stairs and came right up to Cadet Isabella. He tilted his fat, nasty face right up to Isabella's face, telling her that you want to insult those who follow the path of a magical warrior? Standing and looking at the professor, she told him that was not the point of our conversation. All the students looked at Isabel with astonished faces and did not understand what she was doing and what she was trying to accomplish. Turning to the side where the professor and Isabel were standing, Lucas said that this was an insult. He imagined Casagin would be furious if someone called him a wizard. If he had been called a magical warrior, he would have destroyed. The professor screwed up his fat and disgusted face at hearing those words. Isabella looked surprised and thought that this discussion would be very interesting. Professor Kevin grabbed Isabella by the shoulders with both hands and said, "How about this? We'll continue this discussion in my office and just the two of us." She shoved Professor Kevin's hands away and asked him why he was acting like that. He waved his hand in Isabella's direction because he didn't expect such a reaction from the cadet. Then the professor told Isabella that at first he thought she wasn't, but you don't have any manners to talk about. She looked at him with wide open brown eyes. Her face looked surprised. He leaned over to her and said to answer the question, name 3 weapons of a magical warrior. Lucas answered, necklace, belt, and gloves. He sat at his desk and looked at the bald back of Professor Kevin's head, watching his reaction. When he heard the answer, the professor turned his head and stared at him in amazement. Putting his hands behind his head, Lucas sat back in his chair and smiled. He said that Casagin didn't use anything but those 3 items. Then he went on to say that he hadn't listened to him when he told him about getting a little fancier and not parting with those 3 items. He turned questioningly to Professor Kevin and waited for him to respond to his answers to the question. He asked the professor to tell him if he had answered wrongly, if he had made a mistake. He asked the professor. He stood there with a surprised face. He did not think about what he would answer. Then he said the answers were correct. Lucas shouted happily to the whole class that of course they were correct. He couldn't answer them wrong. All the students looked at him in surprise. The students started to talk among themselves that Frey was behaving very strangely today. The professor turned his gaze to Cadet Isabel, looking at her with a languid look. He told Isabel that she didn't know the rules of classroom behavior at all, then grabbed Isabel's arm so she didn't even have time to react to his lunge, then informed her that she needed to come with him to his office for a talk. She rounded her big brown eyes, tears welling up in them. She really didn't want to go to that nasty professor's office. Lucas turned towards the professor and gave him a dismissive look. Lucas thought he had to do something about it. He told the professor that Casagin had always had one habit of saying something to the... All the students looked at Lucas questioningly, and he continued that the love of a woman has a sinister design that destroys a person's self-control. He went on to say that a warrior must be as still as a rock when approaching a woman, because desire does not allow him to stand on his own feet. The professor stood with a surprised face and looked at Lucas, and he continued that whoever fails in these aspects is no better than an animal. He asked Lucas what was the meaning of his words. He replied that he was just saying that, then went on to say that perhaps Casagin was wrong in some of his words. The professor stood and held Isabella's hand and Lucas continued to say that the professor was standing perfectly on his own feet. The professor's face changed drastically. He became very upset and angry. With a furious face, he shouted at the whole class, "Frey Blake!" All the students opened their mouths in fright. He was seething with anger. His teeth were clenched. He was just in a wild rage. Isabella stood with a frightened face, her brown eyes rounded, her mouth open in surprise. The professor told Lucas that you were crazy for answering one pathetic question. Let's see how far your troubled personality will take you. If he gets any of the questions wrong, he'll have to take responsibility as an academy cadet. With a calm face, Lucas turned to Professor Kevin and said he was waiting for the next question. He opened his mouth at Lucas's disgruntlement. His face became angry. He looked at him fiercely. Sweat from exertion was running down his face. The pupils opened their mouths at Lucas's insolence. One of them grabbed his head. He turned his head to Lucas. With a face full of surprise and incomprehension, David looked at him. Isabella looked at him with the same surprised and delighted look. He gave everyone a serious, piercing look. He was afraid of nothing and no one. Lucas knew what he was worth. Sitting down, he asked Professor Kevin if that was the right answer. He sat down on the edge of the table with a surprised look on his face. Then he opened his mouth and started yelling that this is impossible. Even the professors of this academy don't know the history of the Age of Light. The professor stood there thinking, is this the worst student of Frey Blade Academy? At that time the bell rang and Lucas said, "Hooray for lunch." He stood up from his desk and looked at the professor who was staring at him dumbfounded and couldn't say a single word. Asking Professor Kevin if he had any more questions for him. Solving problems is fun, but he was hungry. The professor stood in shock. He didn't understand how a young kid could know the history of 4,000 years ago. Looking at him with a serious and reserved look, Lucas waited for him to answer. Professor Kevin clenched his teeth. He was shaking. He couldn't believe that this boy knew such things. He lowered his head to the floor and tried to find the right words, but he still couldn't recover. Then he squeezed out the words that it was a great job and that it was enough. As he continued to stand there amazed, he couldn't understand how he knew so much and why he was considered the worst student in the academy. Isabella didn't expect this from him. It was as if he had been replaced. The academy building was the canteen for the cadets. All the students were already crowded around the entrance, as it was lunchtime. Shoving his hands into his pants pockets, he walked cheerfully and hummed. He was very hungry and his stomach was churning. Isabella was watching him. Suddenly he heard a voice behind him that said he was going to lunch. He turned around and looked. Isabella stood behind him and looked at him with her big brown eyes. She was holding a textbook in her hands. He turned around and looked at her, and didn't answer her at all. She looked at him with her eyes and waited for some kind of answer. Lucas turned around and continued on his way to the cafeteria without answering Isabella, she thought to herself. He just ignored her. She didn't expect Lucas in Frey's body to ignore her and say nothing. Decidedly taking a step behind him, she was upset that her question was never answered. She continued to follow him. She didn't say anything. She just followed silently behind him. He turned around and with an angry face told her why he was following him. Isabella replied that the girl was going to lunch too. Lucas pointed his index finger in her direction and said that she was talking in a strange way and he didn't like it. The cafeteria was getting crowded. Everyone was rushing to lunch to eat. He had a lot of food, soup, potatoes, bread, meat, and more. When she saw how much he had packed, she wondered if he could eat it all. Lucas told her that if you starve for 4,000 years, you'll appreciate every meal. Bon appetit. As he munched on the meat, stuffing his mouth full, Isabella asked what he meant by 4,000 years. She lowered her eyes and said, "Don't get me wrong, I only sat here because there was no other place to sit." They sat at the same table and ate. Isabella asked him how he knew the history of the Age of Light. She was very interested. He began to tell her that 4,000 years ago, the era of the 4 great magicians began. Sitting with a mouthful of delicious food, he was about to say who he was, but stopped himself. Then he came to his senses and sighed slowly. He couldn't tell that he wasn't really Frey Blake, but Lucas. He looked at Isabella and thought about the fact that 4,000 years had passed and magical development had only degenerated. He wondered why this was happening, or if it was the work of the demigods, he thought. She sat chewing her food, looking questioningly at Lucas, or rather Frey, who was in Lucas's body. He began the story that 4 of the greatest men who had become luminaries of magic, one of them was the greatest warrior Kasijin. The second of the great men was the sage Shuhei Weissman. The third of the great 4 was the black witch Iris Fizbin. And the fourth of these great men was the strongest mage Lucas Troman, the girl's favorite. Thinking and thinking, Isabella said of him that he was indeed one of the greatest men, and any girl, she continued, that any girl would want him to marry her. Lucas's food flew out of his mouth. He started laughing. Isabella, surprised by his behavior, asked what she had said that was so funny. He wiped his eyes from the tears that came from laughing and said she was still wet, and she was already getting married. He said that the older brother was not interested in children. Isabella was indignant and said that he was rude. And when did the girl ask you to marry? The students looked at the table where Isabella and Lucas were sitting in Frey's body and wondered since when she had dined with him. One of the students said to the other that you saw Isabella following him. The other student wondered, no way. Then they started whispering that she was the same smug girl who was trying to get first or second place at the academy. David came into the dining room. One guy told the other that she had rejected even David more than once. The other guy said to keep his voice down. He approached these guys who were discussing him with a tray with food on it. The guy said they didn't mean it and laughed, staring at the table where Isabella was sitting with Frey, or Lucas in Frey's body having a nice conversation. David hated her. She was sitting there all red and angry at Lucas's words, and he was sitting there laughing at her. As David watched them, he thought about how this guy was pissing him off too much today. Sitting at the table and cutting a sausage with a knife, Isabella asked Lucas about the question that Professor Kevin had last asked him. She looked at him questioningly. He had his mouth full of food and a lot of food in his hands. As they continued to eat, Isabella asked about Shuhei's 3 lines of research. Lucas sat with his mouth full of food. She ate and at the same time asked, did you answer Professor Kevin's question that the 3 directions are assimilation, evolution, and conflictology? Assimilation and evolution are the 2 directions Sage Shuhei. She said she only knows 2 directions. Lucas looked at her with his mouth full of surprise. She was surprising him more and more in a good way. Lucas looked at him and said something about if he could tell her about the sage's latest research. What is it? He took a bite of bread and put away the empty dishes from the meal. He asked Isabella what level she was on. She looked at him with her big brown eyes and said her level was 3 stars. As she continued to chew her food, he told her that a 3-star level was not bad for her age. She looked at him and said that once again she noticed that he spoke like a man who had lived a very long life. Clearing his plate of food, he said that he had lived a really long and boring life. She looked at him in surprise and said that she thought he was the same age as she was because he looked young. As they sat at the table, the food finished. Lucas told Isabella that they might or might not be the same age. Isabella wondered what that meant. There was a huge pile of empty plates on their table, all of which Lucas had emptied, and how did he fit it all in? As he sat on the chair and sat at the table, he saw a huge pile of empty plates in front of him, his stomach falling out of his pants. Taking the pile of empty plates in his hands, he walked away, telling Isabel that she was a very slow eater. Turning around to look at her, he looked her in the eye, and she told him that he never told her about Sage Shuhei's 3rd study. Holding a stack of dirty plates in his hands, he told her to read books. He said he was strong in practice, not theory. Isabella looked at him with her mouth hanging open in surprise, and he added that he might not be active. She stood with her hands on the table, her eyes widened. She said, what does it mean not theory, but experience? She watched Lucas walking away like a mesmerized woman, very impressed with him. He was walking and holding a mountain of dirty dishes in one hand, the other hand shoved in his pants pocket. Isabella thought he had been switched. All the apprentices gathered in the arena. Today they would practice magic in a one-on-one duel. The students sat in the stands. The teacher said that only 1st-level magic would be practiced. David sat back and thought, well, finally. He looked around and saw Isabella sitting next to Frey, or rather Lucas in Frey's body. It made him angry. He sat there staring at them. He was angry because they were sitting there talking. Why is Isabella sitting with that bastard? Sitting on the podium next to Lucas, she asked him about the conflict they had with David. He sat there silent. The professor raised her index finger and said about, if you are injured in battle, all responsibility is on you, so keep that in mind. Looking at the professor's girlfriend, who was simply beautiful, Lucas opened his mouth in amazement, and Isabella looked at him with surprised eyes. She looked at him and asked him who he was talking about. Are you talking about Professor J.N.? He sat there mesmerized. He couldn't take his eyes off of the professor. She's gorgeous. He didn't even hear what Isabella was asking. Holding his chin with his hand and closing his eyes, Lucas was daydreaming. Isabella jumped up saying he was crazy to say such things about the professor. He smiled and said that the professor was really beautiful. Isabella was shaking with anger. Looking at Professor Zheying and then at Isabel, he said that she should also learn this thing called perfect female beauty. He kept his eyes on Jaein and drooled, and Isabel told him that he was attracted to older women. The first fight was David versus Frey, or rather Lucas in Frey's body, and the professor announced the start of the fight. He stood staring at the red-headed David, but his mind was on something else. He stood staring at Lucas in Frey's body with angry eyes, waiting for him to punch him in the face. Taking a step forward, one would have thought Lucas was heading towards David, but he wasn't. Turning to him, David said, "How are you feeling? I thought you were dead." He said he'd waited so long last night that he couldn't even sleep, but Lucas walked past David, his hands in his pants pockets. He stood there with his mouth open and stunned. He didn't understand why Lucas walked past him and didn't answer him. When he looked back, he saw Lucas walking straight towards the professor, a look of bewilderment on his face. The students opened their mouths and clutched their heads. They did not expect such a turn of events. Approaching the professor, Jae-in bent her and said that he had been asleep for so long, and now it was clear to him why he had awakened. It's for her sake. He looked at the professor with wide-open eyes and smiled and told her not to worry. Isabella stared at what was happening, thinking to herself, "What is he talking about? Is he out of his mind?" He looked into the eyes of the professor, who opened her mouth in surprise and told her that she would like to share a meal with him tonight. Professor Jae-in started to push him away and told him to go back to his seat. What was he doing? The students all clutched their heads at what they saw, and Lucas went on to say that if he won the fight, she would share a meal with him. But he looked at her with his piercing gaze and heard the laughter behind David's back, who told him not to make people laugh by saying that he would win. The students laughed, saying, "David has 3 stars, and you have 1. Don't be ridiculous. How can you win?" The professor covered one eye and ran her hand through her hair and said if he won, she'd buy him dinner. He turned to her and smiled and told her that she had made a promise and that she had to keep her word. He turned around and went to the middle of the arena where David was waiting for him. The professor was shocked by the situation. When he stepped away from her, her face was covered with a blush and she exhaled with relief. He looked back and looked at her over his shoulder. His inner voice was telling him, "What are you doing? Get a grip," walking and holding his head. He told himself that he can't have his heart fluttering for this young guy. Standing and looking at everything that was going on, David told Frey that he was just crazy. Lucas's eyes were blurred by the beauty of Professor Jae-in. Standing and looking at everything going on, Jae-in told him that he didn't know he liked. Then he asked her to cancel the fight. Lucas was surprised and said, "Why cancel the fight?" David's eyes were bloodshot. He hated Frey so much he was ready to kill him right there. He told him, "You got enough sleep last night. You still realize the situation you're in." He smiled and told him that first he'd rip out his vocal cords. Then he'd shatter his bones so he couldn't scream or fight back. It'd be fun. He held his index finger out in front of him and told him to remember, this day is the last day you walk on your own 2 feet. Looking at that asshole David, who was trying to intimidate him with all his might, Lucas smirked. Then he said that it was impossible to inflict such injuries with the first star magic. Standing against David, who was shouting that he would cripple him and not leave him alive, Lucas was unperturbed. The professor stretched her arm forward and shouted that it was time to start the fight. David stood in the arena. Lucas stood opposite him. The professor stood nearby. The students from the stands were chanting. David grinned and looked at Lucas, who looked at him silently and used Stone Fury. After these words, the earth began to split into pieces as if some kind of earthquake had started. The stones swirled around David. He flew up and a huge boulder was hanging over his head. He controlled it with his hand. The students opened their mouths and started shouting that he was using rock rage. Another one of David's red-headed friends folded his arms across his chest and looked at him calmly from the podium. Isabella's eyes widened. She couldn't believe it, that David would use Stone Fury. She ran up to the professor and said, "Didn't she say that only level 1 magic could be used?" She turned her casual gaze to Isabella, who was all nervous, and said in a calm voice that he wasn't breaking any rules. Isabella didn't understand anything. The professor had said something else before. She was in complete shock from hearing the words that the professor said to her. She began to scream that how it could be that he did not break the rules. She did not understand how it was possible to use magic of the first level. Looking at Lucas with a smirk, he said that this technique is only passed down within his family. "It's our family secret technique, clearly," he said, and kept holding a huge sharp boulder in the air. "And although it's powerful, if you do the right thing, it can be used by a first-level mage," and he pointed his stone straight at Lucas, but no one knew about it. He was hovering overhead, holding the stone above his head. Lucas stood below and calmly said that the secret technique is just like a family symbol, and you're using it to mock a man, right? Lucas asked in David's calm voice. He smiled his snide smile. He stretched his arms forward and started to point the stone in the direction where Lucas was standing. David asked Lucas, "What are you afraid of?" He laughed and looked gloatingly at Lucas. He stood there with a nonchalant look, not a single muscle on his face even twitching. He looked at David and said he wasn't really scared. Lucas thought about that ginger idiot thinking I was shaking with fear. It wasn't, and he raised his hand and said, "Rocket magic." A white round ball formed in his hand. He was completely calm. How could he, a great magician, Be afraid of some brat who thinks he's not God. The students who were sitting on the podium opened their mouths and even got up from their seats to see what Frey, or rather Lucas in Frey's body, had decided to do. They were watching everything that was going on. Isabella's mouth was open in amazement. She didn't expect Frey to do this. Who would have thought it? He was such a bad student. But something had happened to him. It was as if someone had replaced him. Standing in the arena, Lucas was controlling a round ball. He looked at it and thought to himself, "What a good thing, the color is so bright." The students in the stands began to whisper, not knowing what it was. Laughing at the top of his voice, David couldn't stop. He said, "A magic rocket, you say?" and continued laughing, bending in half, and couldn't stop. Hovering in the air above Lucas, and said that he wanted to stop the stone fury with this. "Yeah, this magic is so simple that even someone like Frey can use it." David continued to laugh. Clenching his hand right in front of that circle, Lucas prepared to give him a crushing and powerful blow. Lucas wanted to show that asshole that he was nothing at all. He wanted to teach David a lesson for his arrogance. He unclenched his fist and used his fingers to point the ball in the direction where the arrogant David stood. Lucas thought to himself, "Now we will see who is who. You will answer for your vile behavior and for your mockery." The ball with lightning speed flew straight at David and knocked him down. The blow was so powerful and strong that David could not stand on his feet. From the blow to his torso, he did not even have time to realize how fast it all happened. He started screaming. The blow was so strong that he flew the other way. Before he could even hit Lucas back, his mouth was drooling. He was screaming at the top of his voice. Lucas was happy. He had finally taught this guy a lesson. He flew from the blow straight through the air. His face was contorted in a grimace. He was in pain. He didn't expect such a blow from Frey, who was actually Lucas in Frey's body. Of course, no one knew about it. The blow came directly to his chest. Lucas hit his opponent, and David continued to fly at a great distance, as the force and power of the blow was simply unimaginable. Never before, and none of the students have never seen such a thing. When he landed on the ground, David was lying on his back. His teeth were clenched. His mouth was drooling. His eyes were colorless. He was shaking. The sight was not for the faint of heart. He was lying there and did not move. He could not recover. All the students who were sitting on the stands jumped to their feet and were in complete shock at what they saw. They opened their mouths. They could not believe that Frey had defeated David in the fight. How was it possible? The professor stood also very surprised. She put her hand to her lips and looked at it all. She too could not believe that Frey had managed to defeat David. It amazed and amazed her. An unexpected turn of events, she thought. He stood and looked at David lying there, not a muscle in his face twitching in pain. He stood and stared at him. He was glad that he had been able to teach this insolent man a lesson. He was lying on the ground, not looking like himself. His face was covered in abrasions. Tears were streaming from his eyes, snot from his nose, drool from his mouth. He was writhing in pain with a black mark on his neck from the hit. He looked very pitiful. He thought about the fact that he had lost his voice and could not say a single word. Tears were flowing from his eyes. Snot was coming out of his nose. The whole sight was very unpleasant. He was lying there and could not move. Raising his hands up, David thought to himself that it was very noisy. There were stones all around him. Lucas was standing opposite him. The dazed students were standing aside. Everyone was in complete shock, but not Lucas. He was calm. On the podium were 4 students who were also watching the fight and saw everything that Frey did, or rather Lucas in Frey's body. One of them was standing, the other blonde was sitting and holding a stone. They were interested in Frey. The 4th-year academy student who was standing next to the sitting blonde set about practicing combat using C-grade magic. It was a very interesting sight. This Frey wasn't as simple as it might seem at first glance. One of the students stood up from the podium and looked at the stone he was holding in his hand. He stood there and thought about how this Frey was not so simple. You've got to give that red-haired guy such a beating. Bending over David, who was lying on the ground, and telling him to be shy about using a secret technique for something like this. He was tarnishing his family's reputation, asshole, Lucas told him, and he made noises in response. He was lying on the ground, not looking like himself. His face was all abrasion. Tears were streaming from his eyes, snot from his nose, drool from his mouth. He was writhing in pain. There was a black mark on his neck from the hit. He looked very pitiful. Looking at David smiling, Lucas said something to him. After the vocal cords and continued smiling at the pathetic David, who was covered in snot and tears, his face was all scratched up. Then he summoned the orb he controlled with his hand again and smilingly told David that he had said that after the vocal cords, something would happen to his limbs, and there was talk of shattered bones. He was terrified, and his eyes were full of tears and fear. He was afraid that Lucas was going to throw that magic ball at him again, and then he would be dead. He was lying there shaking in panic. He was looking at Frey, or rather Lucas in Frey's body, who was playfully controlling the magic ball. He told Lucas that he was wrong and he was sorry and asked him to forgive him. He looked at Lucas with eyes full of tears and fear and realized that he almost couldn't speak. Maybe Lucas didn't hear him, why he had taken up the magic ball again. I don't think he's going to throw it at him. And he didn't even think about throwing the magic ball at David. He didn't even think about feeling sorry for him. David deserved to be treated like that, and Lucas didn't feel sorry for him at all. He had to take responsibility for his actions. The blow came right next to David's body. He screamed out loudly in fear. Tears came out of his eyes, his mouth drooled, his face contorted with fear. He opened his mouth wide and began to scream in fear as much as he could. His ligaments were not developed, and it seemed that he just opened his mouth wide. Tears flowed, snot also. A disgusting sight. Sitting on the ground, he stretched his arm forward in front of Lucas, trying to stop him. One of his legs was twisted and broken. He looked horrible, pathetic, trying to stop him from hurting him more. Lucas asked him what was wrong with him. He had chosen this scenario. "Don't you like it?" he asked David. Covering her mouth with her hand, Isabella rounded her eyes in horror. She couldn't believe that Frey could do such a thing. She could barely contain herself from screaming. She wanted the fight to be over quickly. David was lying on the ground with one hand on his arm and the other hand showing Lucas to stop and not to hurt him anymore, as he was already beaten up and had a broken leg. Isabella approached the professor and started to tell her that the winner had already been decided. "Please stop the fight," she shouted. The professor replied that he had not yet answered that he was surrendering, so the fight was not over. She tried to object to the professor that David had lost his voice and could not say anything. That's why he did not say anything. The professor interrupted her and made her understand that she should shut up and go to her seat. The professor looked with one eye at the nervous Isabella, but did not answer her. She continued to look at Lucas and David. She was waiting for the end of the fight. She was not going to stop the fight. Then she added that she had said at the beginning of the fight that the opponents should fight as if it were a real fight and there was no other way to do it. That the path of a master of magic is a path that cannot be traveled, relying on hiccups in a dangerous situation. She stood with her hands on her waist and kept her gaze fixed on the arena where David had just been defeated. Surprised, Isabella looked at her with her big brown eyes. She could not understand the situation and why the professor was talking like that. She was calm and did not express any emotion at all, unlike her. She had her eyes down. She was sad and could not understand anything. She wanted everything to be over as soon as possible. She was very worried when she was watching this fight between David and Frey. Looking at David, who continued to lie there writhing in pain, Lucas's eyes were shining. He was angry, but at the same time, he enjoyed watching the asshole suffer. He lay face down on the ground, which was turned toward Frey, tears rolling from his eyes and drooling from his mouth. Lucas told him that he was so pleased when he bullied him, but I don't think he likes being a victim. Then he shoved his hands in his pants pockets and talked about how the world is getting worse because of people like you who call themselves magicians. But they're really nothing. You're a total jerk. He looked at David lying on the ground with an angry and serious face and told him that it would be better if people like you stopped practicing magic altogether. It would be better for everyone. He hoped that he would take his advice seriously. He took a step forward to David, who tensed up. He was afraid that he might hurt him some more, and he wouldn't be able to bear it because his whole body was aching and whimpering with unbearable pain. He walked over and leaned towards him. David raised his hand and started to cover his face. Lucas told him he was a jerk. It was a joke. Was it any wonder he thought of Lucas smashing his bones? Then he turned around and put his hands in his pockets and walked away from David, telling him that, "You know what? I'm being kind. You look so pathetic. I think your legs will be enough for you," Lucas said to David, and slowly started to walk away. He was lying on the ground. His face was covered with wounds and abrasions. He was in snot and tears. He looked back to see if Lucas had left. His body was aching and sore. His leg was broken. He prayed that it would all be over quickly. He was exhausted and his whole body was aching. His bones ached. His face was covered in wounds, cuts, and abrasions. His voice still hadn't come back to him. He looked back to see if Lucas had left. He felt really bad. Lucas looked over his shoulder at him with a piercing look. There was no sympathy in his eyes. He hated people like David, the ones who bullied people for no reason, the ones who said mean things. He grabbed his leg. His eyes bulged with fright. He could feel only one leg, but what happened to the other leg? Panic gripped him, pain restrained his movements. He groaned, lying on the ground. His face was in a terrible state. Snot was coming out of his nose. One of his legs was twisted backwards. His kneecap was shattered. He couldn't move, let alone get up. Turning to David and smiling broadly, Lucas had a glowing magic rocket in his hands. He looked at David, who was lying miserably, but it seemed to him that he had gotten very little and needed more. Lucas came to David, who was lying there shaking with fear and was very frightened and did not know what to do. Meanwhile, Lucas pointed the magic rocket directly at David, who looked at him with horror in his eyes. He tried to scream with all his might, but he couldn't because his ligaments were damaged. Tears were pouring from his eyes. His face was distorted in a grimace of horror. If he could, he would have run away, but unfortunately he couldn't and lay immobilized. Two fourth-year students stood on the podium and talked among themselves. One of them said that it seems that this guy is from the first year. Who is he? The other one said he was pretty good for a freshman. One of the fourth-year cadets was a tall, blue-eyed blonde. He had a confident look in his eyes and seemed superior to the guy next to him. He was looking at Frey intently, or rather it was Lucas in Frey's body. The two of them stood and looked at him. He seemed strong enough for a freshman, but they didn't know his name, so the blonde with blue eyes instructed the other guy to find out his name and all possible information about it. The two fourth-year students moved towards the academy building. They couldn't wait to find out the name of the guy who had so cleverly dealt with their classmate. They had a very interesting offer for him. The cadets crowded on the academy grounds and discussed the fight between David and Frey. Some of them said that Frey had defeated David in a duel. Others stood there not believing their ears. Conversations continued between the cadets. One of the cadets said that their classmates had personally seen the fight. David's leg was broken and that's why he was sent home. Another guy said that he wondered how he would become a wizard now. David and Frey's classmates were sitting in the classroom and talking among themselves. One of them said that David deserved it because he was a very nasty guy. Now the atmosphere in the academy is much more pleasant after David was sent home. The students continued to discuss the fight, and one said, well, how did that idiot manage to beat him? How did it all happen, and what was really there? Another guy said, look, here he comes. Keep your voice down, or he'll hear. Walking through the academy with his head held high, Lucas stuck his hands in his pants pockets. All the cadets turned around and looked at him with open mouths. One of them even whispered, maybe he made a deal with the devil? Suddenly, one of the fourth-year guys who had been watching the fight came up to him and asked him if he was Frey Blake. Lucas then asked him about who he was. He wondered why this fourth-year guy came up to him, what he wanted from him. Freshman Frey Blake, very curious. He stared at the fourth-year guy and waited for an answer. The guy who approached Lucas told him that he was a fourth-year student, and his name was Dauman Milost. He stood and scrutinized him. Dauman stood and smiled. Lucas tried to figure out what he wanted from him, putting his hands in his pockets and said, fourth-year guy, and so you're a sunbai. Dauman asked him, so you're Frey Blake, the guy who beat David in last night's fight? We watched your fight. He told him to join the Troman fraternity. Lucas looked at him with surprised eyes. A fraternity, Lucas thought to himself. A fraternity named after me. That's something interesting. He looked at Dauman in surprise and asked what the name of the fraternity was. He thought to himself, very interesting. What they do in that fraternity. They named it after him. Funny, of course. He put his hand to his face and said, yes, since you are a student at our academy, you must have heard of this fraternity. It's called the Truman Fraternity. Everyone knows about it. Everyone in our academy. Then he continued to talk about the fraternity. He said that it is a group of students that represents West Road Academy. You must have heard a lot about our fraternity Troman, since it is known by all the students of the academy. And raising his hand to his face, he showed Lucas the name Ring of the fraternity. He said that not everyone gets such a chance to join the fraternity. It falls only to the chosen ones, who are elected by the fraternity itself. Showing his hand with the ring to Lucas, he said that it was a runic ring confirming the membership of the Brotherhood. Isn't it cool? Said Dauman and smiled. He kept showing him the ring from all sides. Lucas thought about what it was called when you use someone else's name. And he said, if you have this ring after you've had it, after you've had this ring, 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 after you've had this ring. If you have this ring after graduation, you can do whatever you want. In short, you don't have to worry about food. Lucas covered his face with his hand. He remembered that he had no family now. He kept on saying that it's not all. Truman is in charge of the Brotherhood, but don't fall down. He is in charge. Now you will be shocked when you find out who is in charge of the Brotherhood." Lucas turned the other way. Holding his head, Lucas told him that he refused. Dumon was shocked. He said, "What are you talking about? It's the same Brotherhood. How could you have decided to give it up without thinking?" Suddenly there was a voice behind Dumon's back telling him to stop persuading. He wasn't the type to be enticed by it. "So shut up and don't beg him anymore. You understand me?" said the blue-eyed blonde. He turned and greeted Mr. Pierre June. When Lucas heard his name, he looked over his shoulder. For some reason, the name seemed familiar to him. He stared at the tall, blue-eyed blonde. Dauman bowed. Pierre stood and stared at Frey, or rather Lucas, in Frey's body. He didn't say anything. He just looked at him with his blue eyes. Lucas turned around and got a better look at him. He couldn't understand why his face and name were familiar to him. Maybe Frey knew him, and that's why his body reacted to this man. Lucas didn't understand it. Pierre told him that this was the first time we were seeing each other. He said that he was the head of the fraternity. Turning to them, Lucas listened attentively to their apology and their suggestion to think and join their fraternity, as they would be very happy to have him join their ranks. The head of the Brotherhood stood looking at Lucas with his blue eyes and did not avert his gaze. He waited for him to respond to his words, silently standing and waiting for his reaction and hoping for a positive answer. Standing opposite them, his hands were shoved in his pants pockets. His face expressed absolute disinterest. He didn't even try to hide it in any way. He was not interested in anything Pierre and Domon were saying. He looked at Pierre. He was very young, but he was very confident. He thought he was very clever, very strong. That's why he was probably the leader of the Troman Brotherhood. They all respected him and even bowed down to him. He thought about the fact that Pierre was very confident. Despite his young age and despite his age, he had a very good level. Lucas continued to stare at him in silence. Then he waved his hand and said that he did not want to join any fraternity, what he could become there. He had no desire. He wasn't even planning on joining anything. Then he turned around and went the other way. And with his hand up, he told them that he would not charge them anything, so he suggested that they live together. Dumon was seething with anger. He said he was insolent. Dumon was seething with anger. He lamented, "How dare this guy?" He clenched his hands into fists. He was shaking all over. Pierre just silently raised his hand, signaling to Dauman to shut his mouth and calm down. Pierre turned his head towards Dauman and flashed his blue eyes at him, letting him know to come to his senses and stop his incomprehensible behavior here. Pierre was extremely restrained and not a muscle in his face flinched. Clutching his head, he began to apologize to Pierre for his intemperate behavior, but Lucas's attitude just pissed him off. He couldn't even hold back. He just resented his insolent behavior. He stood silently watching Lucas walk away from them. There was no emotion on his face. He just stood there looking at him, absolutely silent with a stone face. He understood everything and just kept silent. The restaurant, a beautiful place. It is made like a small palace. At the entrance, there are tables. Near the restaurant, there are couples, men dressed in beautiful suits, ladies in hats and evening dresses. Very beautiful and romantic atmosphere. The table in the restaurant is bursting with food. White wine is poured in glasses. Various dishes are on the table. There is meat with side dishes, various vegetables. The professor fulfilled her promise and invited Lucas to dinner at the restaurant. The professor sat at the table, leaned her hand on her chin, and looked at Lucas. She said that since she had promised, she had invited him to go to the restaurant tonight and treat him to dinner. She looked and smiled. He was sitting at the table. In his hand, he was holding a fork with a big piece of meat on it. He turned his head to Isabella, who was sitting next to him eating. He said he told her to leave. He told her to put the fork down and not to put the food in her mouth. She looked down at her plate and shoved a mouthful of food in her mouth and chewed it. Lucas was shaking with anger. He wanted to eat with the professor and she was here. Isabella said not to pay any attention to her because that wasn't why she came. Lucas and Isabella sat at the round table in the restaurant. Lucas told her to get out of here. She should realize the situation she was in, but she didn't pay any attention to his words. Professor Jae-in was sitting pensive at the table. She put her hand on the table and put her hand under her chin and said thoughtfully that she couldn't find any information related to that battle. I thought it was very strange. Lucas looked at her with a mouthful of food. Then Isabella said that if he didn't tell her anything, she should follow him until he told her everything in detail. She asked Isabel, "You are talking about the battle. Are you talking about Kasanji's way of training?" She asked her. She was curious. She wanted to know the information. She looked at the professor with a surprised look on her face. She asked her if she knew about Kasanji's training too. And with a questioning face, she waited for an answer without taking her eyes off of Jae-in. She closed her eyes and put her wine glass to her mouth and said that she had heard about it a little bit at a scientific conference of magicians Of course, I would like to know much more about it, but unfortunately, I did not get the opportunity. She said that she had been in various libraries, very much looking for any information. Reviewed hundreds of books, but nothing she could not find, no matter how much she wanted to. Unfortunately, there is no information. Then Jae-in flirtatiously put her hand to her lips and said that you're talking about what Frey knows about it, and if it's not just some kind of bragging, she would also love to hear his story about Kasanji's training. They looked at Lucas, who sat there nonchalantly drinking from his glass as if he wasn't listening to the conversation between them and wasn't interested in it at all. Then he got up from the table and slowly walked over to Professor Jae-in and stood behind her back and put his hands on her shoulders, slowly lowered himself to the level of her ear, and whispered that he could tell her something more interesting. He leaned over to her and whispered in her ear that their conversation could continue after dinner in her room. From these words, she blushed so much that she was so embarrassed that she couldn't even answer him. He gently took her head and ran his hand through her hair. Professor Jae-in sat all red and could not understand what was happening to her. This is her student, who is younger than her by 20 years. She did not understand what was happening to her. Then he lowered himself to her lips. There was some fog in the professor's head. She had a feeling that her head and her heart were working completely differently. She sighed languidly and was ready to kiss him. Suddenly, their idyll was interrupted by a heavy pounding on the table. Their mouths opened in surprise, and they were even frightened. It was Isabella who was watching the whole scene, and she obviously did not like what was happening. She pounded her fists on the table and shouted that how he could do this to the teacher, Professor Jae-in blushed and embarrassed. And Lucas told Isabel that she should have left a long time ago. It was late evening outside. The stars were shining in the sky, and there was a bright full moon, which shone and lit up all the streets, which were quiet and peaceful. Such beauty can be admired endlessly. Silence, beauty, and peace. He stood on the pier with his hands on the railing and looked into the distance. He stood pensive. The river was flowing below. A lantern was shining on the side. The weather was just marvelous. Quiet and calm late evening. Leaning on the railing, he looked at the river. His look was sad and very thoughtful. He could stand for a long time in such a state, because this world and many people in this world disappointed him a lot. He was thinking that it was strange if demigods ruled this world now, thinking that we were an eyesore for them. I thought that traces of us and memories had completely disappeared, but he was wrong. Everything was completely different. Standing on the dock, he looked at the water and pondered. Even after 4,000 years, the information about Kasejin, Shuhei, Aris, and I, all of us, remained the same. Lucas stared thoughtfully into the distance, wondering how he should proceed tomorrow. Supporting his chin with his hand, he continued to stand alone and ponder. He thought about the fact that maybe there was someone fighting in our name right now. He had a lot to figure out. He had to figure it all out. When Isabella left the restaurant, she found him standing on the pier looking at the water. He was pensive and paid absolutely no attention to her. She silently stood behind him and watched him. Then he noticed her and turned his head in her direction. Isabel blushed from embarrassment and stood silently looking at him with her big brown eyes. She did not know what to say or what to ask him, as Lucas was very thoughtful. It was already late evening outside. There were stars in the sky, and there was a lantern that was burning and illuminating the dark street. Lucas turned to Isabel and told her that he wanted to ask her something. She stood silent and waited for his question. He asked her who was the strongest in this academy. She dulled her big brown eyes and replied, "Who is the strongest in the academy?" "You talk like you're some kindergartner," she answered Lucas. He turned to Isabel with a sad face and raised his index finger up and said that it doesn't matter. "So who is the strongest of the cadets and teachers? Answer me. Who is the strongest of them?" Lucas didn't stop. She closed her eyes and said that he still had not answered her question, which she asked him, but he was asking questions and waiting for them to answer him. It was not fair. She also wanted to get an answer to her question. He turned to face Isabel and leaned on the railing and said that if she answered his question, he would tell her everything. She didn't know what to do with herself. She asked if it was true that he would tell her everything. She clenched her fists and squeezed her eyes shut, a blush covering her face. She was jumping for joy to know that he would tell her everything. Lucas looked at her and he was surprised that she was as excited as a little kid about what he'd promised her. She leaned next to him and started talking about how the strongest among the students was Pierre June, among the teachers Professor Dio Polsman, and Professor Adelia. "But still the strongest is my aunt," Lucas asked in surprise. "Your aunt?" He looked at Isabel in surprise. It turns out her aunt is the principal of West Road Academy. Her name is Ceres Tristan. Lucas stood with a pensive face. Very interesting, he thought to himself. Isabel hadn't mentioned it before. As they left the restaurant, Professor J.N. walked over to them and folded her arms across her chest. She could hear what they were talking about. She was interested in their conversation and immediately decided that she should join the discussion. She started talking about how she was a 6-star mage that everyone in the kingdom called Eternal Ice. It was Professor J.N. who was talking about the Academy's headmaster, Cerise Trizane, who was Isabel's aunt. Standing and listening attentively to the professor, he said aloud, "Wow, 6 stars." Isabel stood smiling. She was proud that it was her aunt, and she was so strong, and she was also the Academy director. The three of them stood talking. Lucas said that theoretically, mages could reach 9 stars. Professor J.N. said that the last person who reached that level lived 3,000 years ago. Professor J. Ying said that there are many speculations whether it is true or not, so 9 stars is the limit for a mage. But even mages with 8 stars are not more than 10 in the whole world. So 9 stars can be considered a legend. He turned back and looked at the Academy, which was covered from above by a large dome that protected. Lucas stood and thought about everything Isabella and Professor J.N. had told him. He pondered looking at the dome that was over the Academy. Looking at the Academy, he asked about the magic that protects the Academy was also created by the principal. Lucas looked at Professor J.N. and waited to see what she would tell him about all this and what she would tell him. Professor J.N. told him that she wasn't sure, but it was possible that she had done it. No one knew. The protection had been in place for a long time, and who had put it in place was anyone's guess. He turned back to the Academy and looked at the dome that protected him. He thought to himself that it didn't look like 6 stars at all. Lucas thought it was all very strange. He wanted to find out what was going on here. He remembered Pierre, who suggested him to join the Troman Brotherhood. Lucas began to think about all this, and his mind was a mess. He couldn't figure out what was going on, and he needed to do it urgently. The three of them stood in silence. Lucas thought that there might be something wrong here. He could feel that something was wrong. Cerise Tristan might know something. He thought that he just needed to meet the director of the Academy, Cerise Tristan, part-time Aunt Isabel. He called her. She asked him what he wanted to know from her, but Lucas abruptly stopped talking. He started thinking. He looked at Isabel. He thought that it was probably a bad idea to ask her to organize a meeting with the headmaster of Cerise Tristan Academy. He didn't want to involve Isabel in everything. There would be too many questions. He stood next to Isabel and thought to himself that while I don't know how things are going with the demigod, I shouldn't drag an ignorant person into this. Depending on the situation, I may have to fight with the principal. He leaned on the railing and said that he might have to upgrade to 7 stars. Behind him was Isabella and Professor J.N., who looked at him questioningly. 7 stars? Isabella asked in surprise. The professor laughed and said that to reach 7 stars, it would take 20 years, at least 10 years. What are you talking about? It is simply impossible to do in such a period of time. It is a long training. Staring at the water and a little silent, he answered Jay, in that if you try hard enough, it can be achieved during the vacation period in the academy. She asked him in surprise, "What are you saying? Are you out of your mind?" Then she closed her eyes and said with a smile that someday your dreams could come true. As they say, it's not wrong to dream, it's wrong not to dream, she said to Lucas with a smirk. He turned around and looked at her with his languid gaze, and he didn't take his eyes off of her but stared at her and was silent. Then he suddenly went straight to Professor J.N. He came up behind her. He put his arm around her waist. He leaned towards her and said that, "You think I only have big dreams, but what about my great love? Do you want to check it out, Professor J.N. blushed and thought to herself, "Oh my God, he is my student." As always, their idyll was interrupted by Isabella, who continued to stand nearby, and at the sight of all these actions, loudly began to cough into her fist, making it clear that they are not alone and behave extremely ugly and indecent towards her. Looking at them, Isabella raised her index finger up and said that he had better be careful or she would tell her aunt, who is the director of the academy, about everything he was doing with the teacher in front of her eyes, without shame. After Isabella's words, he became sad and lowered his eyes. He thought about why she was always following him and preventing him from talking to Professor J.N. He couldn't understand what she wanted from him, following him around like a tail everywhere. He turned his back to Isabel and told her that was why he didn't like the little ones. She was angry at his words. How dare he call her a little girl? He doesn't know what he's saying anymore. Professor J.N. supported Lucas in calling her a baby. Isabella was furious. How could it be possible that the professor supported him when he called her a baby? She clenched her fists. He stood alone, leaning on the railing and looking at the water. Isabella stood next to Professor J.N. and said, "What do you mean agreeing with him?" T.A., in a calm tone, said it was nothing like that. "It's a beautiful night. The lights are on in the houses. The pier is water. The lantern is lit. There's practically no one on the street anymore. Only Lucas, Isabella, and Professor J. Understanding it's quiet and peaceful. The sky is in the stars. The lanterns are shining, illuminating the pier and the water." He stood looking at the water, leaning on the railing. He reflected that he didn't need to rush. He needed to do what he could do right now. He stood and pondered everything. He just needed to think hard. Lucas stood with a pensive face and looked into the distance. The river was flowing below. A lantern was shining on the side. The weather was just marvelous. It was a quiet and peaceful late evening, and he was the only one who was not calm at all, and his mind was spinning. It was already late evening outside. The stars were shining in the sky, and there was a bright full moon, which was shining and illuminating all the streets, which were quiet and peaceful. Such beauty can be admired endlessly: silence, beauty, and peace. Legs with crutches, one leg in plaster. It was David who came to the academy. After the fight with Lucas, he had a broken leg and was at home recovering. He could hardly walk on his crutches. All around the students looked at him. The students stood with their mouths open and looked at David, who was walking on crutches. He was very angry and was cursing at Frey, or rather Lucas in Frey's body. He was saying that Frey was a scumbag, and how dare he attack him. Walking on crutches, David yelled at the whole academy that he didn't know what he had done, but he couldn't lose to that bastard. He said he would kill him. His face contorted with rage. He could barely contain his anger. He was looking for Frey. He rushed into the classroom. All the students turned to see David on crutches entering the classroom with a furious face. He was heading towards Frey, who was sitting quietly at his desk and not paying attention to anyone around him. As he sat quietly reading a book, he heard a familiar voice in the distance. It was David yelling at him about something he thought he could get away with. He didn't even turn in his direction and continued reading the book. A furious David clenched his teeth and with an angry face approached Lucas and told him that he would do anything to make him regret being born into this world. He would destroy him. His anger was boiling in him. He wanted to take revenge on him. His eyes were glowing with anger. He opened his mouth and yelled at the whole class that he would call all the guys. And then he would be finished. Lucas sat quietly without giving any sign and didn't even move towards him, as he didn't care about it. He kept yelling loudly and stopped Lucas from reading the book. Then Lucas, without raising his eyes and without taking his eyes off the book, raised his hand up and with his index finger said "magic rocket," and immediately David got hit. He flew to the other side. Without even turning to him, he continued reading the book. He flew to the other side from the blow and fell on the floor. His crutches flew in different directions and broke. All the students turned to him and looked at him with open mouths. 3 students with a frightened look approached David lying on the floor with a cast on his leg and looked at him with rounded eyes, trying to see if he was all right, if he was alive or not after such a blow. He was lying on the floor, his mouth was open, drool was coming out of his eyes, tears were rolling from his eyes. He had received another blow. He did not even expect that he would receive such a crushing blow with a magic missile again. He was lying there and could not come to his senses. Looking at him, you could think that he was not himself. His mouth was drooling, his eyes were not clear at all, and the bridge of his nose was broken. Cadet David went home again. That's what happens when you get the wrong guy. The class started, and Professor Kevin came in and announced that David would not be there. He went home and would be getting his nose bridge fixed. Everyone in the class listened silently to Professor Kevin, who went on to say that David had broken his nose bridge. Lucas walked down the corridor of the academy with his hands in his pockets. He was pensive and thought about David's words, who said that he would call his boys and they would show him. He thought about what those kids could do to him. He thought to himself that, no, he didn't expect much from these boys, but they must have some level. This is a prestigious institution, the elite West Road Academy. Shouldn't they have some skill? He thought about the fact that in order to use as much mana in Frey's body as possible, he needed to train as much as possible. He couldn't increase his mana any other way, only through constant training. He was walking down the corridor of the academy when he suddenly heard a voice behind him saying, "Hey, you gray-haired man, stop. You're the one who turned David into a rag," the unfamiliar voice said to him, and he stopped. He turned to the man who was talking to him and looked at him silently. He stood with his hands in his pants pockets and told Lucas to come out with him. He looked at the guy questioningly, not understanding what he wanted him to do. He turned and looked at the guy he was talking to. The guy was not small in height and size with brown eyes. He told him that they say you are good at magic. The guy led him to a basement, and there were a bunch of other students there. Lucas stood and watched with his hands in his pockets. He wasn't even worried about it, and he didn't even care about the number of students in the basement. Everyone stood there and grinned at Lucas, and the guy who brought him to the basement said, "Don't you know who you're talking to? My name is Alex Drimid." Lucas stood there staring at him in silence. He didn't even know him. The seniors sat and looked at Lucas with a dismissive smile as they watched Alex try to get him to talk. Alex said about being his much-revered sunbai. "Don't you know about that?" Alex asked him. He stood in front of Lucas. He was tall and big. Lucas reached his shoulder. He put his hand forward with his index finger and poked at him. Told him that people like him pissed him off. He shouted at Lucas with a furious face and told him what he had done to his brother David, "Whom I am your esteemed sunbae, you pikey pig," Alex shouted angrily, looking at Lucas. He stood with a nonchalant face and listened to Alex's utterances. Then he went on talking about David's broken leg and bridge of his nose, and how are you going to be responsible for that? He stood there with an indifferent face and didn't even move. He was standing in front of Alex, then he turned around and saw that behind him there were some other high school students. Lucas turned to Alex with a question. Is he going to scare him? Lucas said very interestingly, turning back. The one with the angry face raised his hand up to hit Lucas and asked him, "How dare he talk to Sunbae on your tongue?" Lucas looked at him, and not a single muscle on his face twitched. He was thinking about what he wanted, twisted his face and said, oh, those little guys, how they pissed him off. Lucas thought to himself that he was sick of these little squabbles. He had other goals in mind, and he didn't want to deal with these youngsters at all. Alex clenched his teeth and told him that he thought too much of himself. If he had defeated David, who did he think he was? He had lost his fear. It's been a long time since you've gotten one. Lucas opened his mouth wide and yawned defiantly, and Alex continued to tell him that he knew who he was. He was a man who had risen to 1/16th in the last magic contest. Do you know what that means? He turned his disgruntled face to the other side. He was tired of Alex's chatter. He was tired of listening to him. But he didn't stop and said that prepare for your funeral today. He stood across from Alex and looked around at the crowd of high school students gathered around them. He said about bringing a freshman into a crowd like that, and now you're standing there bragging about it.